Unfunded public employee pensions is a problem that's not going away anytime soon. And while the legislature made significant changes to the pensions of new state employees, there are some that think that those changes did not go far enough because they didn't address the public employee pensions of current employees. Are changes in the pensions of current public employees necessary? Or is the underfunding of public employee pensions a problem several years in the making that will require some patience and several years to fix? We'll ask advocates on both sides of the issue. Marcia Fritz, Director of Californians for Fiscal Responsibility. Christy Bouma, a principal with Capital Connection, a lobbying firm that represents California firefighters, the CSEA, and other public employees. And we'll talk with Jon Ortiz, who writes the Sacramento Bee's state worker blog that's considered a go-to resource for the latest rumblings at the state capitol on public employee pensions. Public employee pension reform. Is patience a virtue?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. In 2012, California enacted pension reform. Most of the reforms, however, impacted new rather than current employees. Does more need to be done, or do we simply have to be patient and let the reforms kick in? Our guests probably have different answers to that question. They are Christy Bouma, who's a principal with Capital Connection, a lobbying firm that represents public employees, and Marcia Fritz with Californians for Fiscal Responsibility, a pro-pension reform group. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Marcia, let me start with you. Can you briefly explain the magnitude of the pension problem and whether or not the 2012 reforms went far enough?
Well, the magnitude is of the problem. We're underfunded about $500 billion, and we're paying that off over time. Our costs are really high. The pension reform measure over 30 years will provide savings of about $100 billion. So it went a long way toward helping, but it's not fixing the entire $500 billion.
Christy, $500 billion problem?
So I would, if just to be a little levity, I would quote my grandfather. He always said, "Christy, figures lie and liars figure." So my only response is we probably disagree on whether $500 billion is an accurate
but it is a big problem.
Certainly it's a problem, and you can make it bigger by changing assumptions. You can make it smaller and both sides play games with those numbers. So
I think Mark Twain said there are lies, damn lies, and statistics in that order.
Exactly.
So what are your statistics?
I actually share Marcia's statistics about how the pension reform solves the problem to the tune of
about $100 billion?
$50 to $100 billion. I would be probably more conservative because it's markets are involved, assumptions are involved, and then the actions of retirement boards, and I think we'll get to that later about what, how quickly does a fund recover based on, assumptions that are made by these plans.
Christy, last year's reform measures didn't ignore current employees completely. Current employees are going to pay half of what's called normal costs of their retirement. Will that eventually cover the unfunded liability?
So I'll probably repeat myself a little. That will contribute greatly. And one thing that I didn't mention in your previous question is that what's rarely talked about, although you do see it in some articles, is that the bargaining table is taking care of another big piece of the unfunded liability. I know that the members of the California Professional Firefighters, who I'm more closely connected with what's happening at the bargaining table, are agreeing to pay above and beyond 50% of normal cost, have done even prior to the 2012 reform, and continue to particularly that issue, go to the table with that issue.
Marcia, paying half the normal cost, is that going to take care of the unfunded liability?
Well, no, because there's two parts to your contribution. You have your normal costs, and then you have your unfunded liability costs.
So normal costs are what you you have to pay to fund your specific pension.
Right.
But the unfunded liability is everybody else that hasn't been funding their pension. Is that it?
Yeah. It's caused by several different factors: market losses, wages that spiked higher than what the actuaries assumed when they set these rates years ago, lots of different people living longer. That's what causes the unfunded liability. For the typical firefighter in California, let's put it in dollar number terms. Their normal cost is about 24% of wages, but then over and above that, we have to contribute another 30% of their wages toward the unfunded liability. So many fire districts, their total pension cost is over 50% of their wages. And that's what we're talking about. So the firefighters up until now, up until the reform last year, most of them were paying nothing toward their pension costs. 100% of it was picked up by the taxpayer.
You know, Christy, I want to ask you about your point about negotiations. I mean, if you have negotiations on pension issues, isn't ultimately you're going to be kind of a net zero? Because there's going to be a quid pro quo. If the employees give back something on pensions, they're going to want something else, some other benefit. So aren't you just at a net zero?
I wouldn't say that's always the case. Of course, that's, you know, the collective bargaining, that's the point of, you know, mutual exchange of benefits. But firefighters, since we're talking about those specifically, and I could go back on a couple things that were entirely accurate, but, you know, I have my president of the CPF now negotiated a contract before he became the president of the CPF 8 years ago, where the employees agreed to pay 23% of pay towards their pensions. So to suggest that it was only the saving grace of this 2012 reform that caused firefighters to be forward-thinking, and so to your question, they're members of their community. The city, the county, the district is their employer. If an employer doesn't survive and ends up like a Stockton, Vallejo,
San
Bernardino, it is not in their interest. So they come to the bargaining table with that reality. And so I would offer to you that what I've seen my firefighter locals report is they don't just exchange one benefit for another. Maybe they focus on non-economic issues, you know, shift priority, vacation scheduling, all the other things that are, you know, on the bargaining table but not necessarily have an economic impact.
I've only got 30 seconds left in this segment.
Sorry,
I want to ask you a question, Marcia, about can state pension funds bypass the entire negotiating process and take unilateral action by doing things like changing the discount rate to address the problem?
No, because they've got very strict parameters within the governmental accounting standards and the actuarial standards to do that. No, they can't do it and still comply with their standards. But she's focused on one district where their firefighters are paying toward their pensions. Our research before pension reform last year was that most public safety workers did not contribute to their pensions.
And public safety is police and fire.
This is statewide. Most of them did not.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to discuss the strategies and tactics used by public employee pensions in their debate in 2014. What are the likely scenarios? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Christy Bouma, principal with Capital Connection, a firm that advocates for public employees, and Marcia Fritz, director of Californians for Fiscal Responsibility, that advocates for pension reform. So, Christy, what about this San Bernardino versus Stockton issue? San Bernardino is using bankruptcy to get out of his pension obligation. Stockton isn't. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, just generally, I guess I'd probably just highlight the one issue that I think has been in dispute in San Bernardino, which is, you know, do public employee pensions compare to a debt issuance? One thing, there's strictly a risk investment tool. The return is based on the risk versus, you know, a way to defer salary to save for retirement. They're not the same thing. So I think we're all very interested in what the outcome will be and the impact on pensions in the future, but it's certainly to expect that someone who's profiting off taking a risk and backing debt versus a pension fund, they're just apples and oranges and shouldn't be treated the same.
So San Bernardino using bankruptcy protection, attempting to, Stockton saying, no, we're going to pay our pension obligations. What's the better approach?
Well, I think Stockton's deal relies on a tax increase, and there's no question that the tax increase is a pension tax. So the question, if the voters agree that they'll pay this pension tax in order to keep the city running, then I think Stockton had a real good deal. I think the workout with the bondholders and not touching pensions was really good on their part. It depends on that tax increase. If San Bernardino is doing what they can, we believe pensions and bonds are both debt, and the Governmental Accounting Standards Board agrees with me that if you don't fund a promise, whether it's to pay a bond back or to pay a pension, if you don't fund it properly, then that's a debt. And they should be treated similarly.
You know, I wanted to ask you about Governor Brown's proposal last year, the 12-point proposal. One of the things that he wanted in there that he didn't get was this hybrid plan of changing traditional pensions to a combination of traditional pensions plus a 401k. You think that idea is likely to resurface in 2014?
It's possible. You know, we'd love to say it's about ideology that drives what ends up on the ballot, but I'm sure people are testing all sorts of ideas to continue to get at this issue where sides disagree. But I would also suggest that the pension reform that the governor achieved is a version of a hybrid plan now, because it is not just reduced pension formulas, but it's also got an affiliated cap. So there is an absolute ceiling at what the defined benefit can accrue to, and anybody who wants to save more in retirement would then have to turn to a defined contribution type vehicle to save above and beyond that pension.
So the governor's hybrid plan is one option. Another thing being floated by San Jose Mayor Chuck Reed, a Democrat, is to ask voters to change the California Constitution and allow state and local governments to lower pensions prospectively for current employees. So you'd keep what you had accrued up to this point, but then change it going forward. Is that breaking a promise to those employees, or making necessary changes based on changing reality?
I think it's allowing changes to be made to ensure that the system is solvent. And he's got as far as I understand, he's got the backing of 9 other Democrat city mayors in California for his idea. And he's really not breaking a promise. These are tools that that the private companies have had forever. If they've got a pension plan that they find out is too expensive, then they make adjustments to it going forward. We've had that in the private sector, and he's just making government workers on the same plane as what we have in the private sector.
Briefly, Christy, what is your response?
It's a broken promise to workers.
That's a brief response.
Right.
Well, I want to thank Christy Bouma with Capital Connection and Marcia Fritz with Californians for Fiscal Responsibility for joining us. Up next, one of Sacramento's most knowledgeable observers of public employee issues, Jon Ortiz, who writes the state worker blog for the Sacramento Bee. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now joined by Jon Ortiz, who writes the Sacramento Bee's State Worker blog. That's a must-read if you want to know about what's happening with state and public employees. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks, Mark.
You recently reported that California public pension payouts have doubled after a bump in benefits, with police and fire actually benefiting the most. What were your findings?
Yeah, we took a look at some internal reports from CalPERS, the state's big pension fund, and what we found was that the initial retirement check for state and local employees had, as you said, doubled and in some cases even tripled, reflecting changes, I think, in how pension benefits have been calculated since 1999.
Now, part of that is the pension calculation, part of it also is the higher salaries.
That's right. Yeah, the higher salary contributed to probably half to 3/4 of those increases, with changes to formula to the way benefits are calculated essentially contributing to the balance, amplifying the effect of the pay raises.
You know, there were a bunch of reforms back in 2012 regarding public employee pensions, and there was a big brouhaha recently involving the U.S. Secretary of Labor and those pension reforms. What happened?
Well, the federal government ties mass transit grants, about $1.6 billion for California, to employers preserving their employees' collective bargaining rights or their collective representation for states that don't have collective bargaining. And when the governor signed that law, the mass transit unions objected, saying that the rules that it imposed on their employers to change their pensions violated that federal condition of getting the money. So essentially that money's been held hostage.
Okay, so under the law, employees have a right to negotiate over things like wages and benefits.
Correct.
And they were saying that we weren't given this right. The governor and the legislature changed the pension rules without negotiating.
That's right. So they struck a bargain, and just recently the governor filed a lawsuit in federal court. The courts are going to settle that fight. In the meantime, about 20,000 mass transit employees are out from under the state's pension law. They are continuing as they did before while this thing gets hashed out in the courts.
Okay, now there's a change in some government accounting rules. Sounds pretty arcane and really in the weeds, as we were talking about when we were off camera. A recent report, though, from CalSTRS said that their debt, and this is for the teacher retirement fund, would increase almost $100 billion under the new accounting rules. So can you briefly tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, this is all about what crystal ball you're going to use to predict the future. And the way that the rules have been so far is that pension funds could essentially make an assumption about how much their investments would return to them. And that's important because then it allows them to discount their liabilities by that amount. So what this new rule does is it says that the part that you don't have the money to cover, you have to assume you're going to get less of a return on investments to cover that amount. And that's why CalSTRS is looking at $170 billion instead of $171 billion in unfunded liabilities because of that lower rate of return they have to assume.
You know, there are lots of pension reform proposals in 2012. Some of them passed, but all of them really affected new employees, not current employees. So when are we going to see the effects of that pension reform, the 2012 pension reform?
It will take years, many years. Experts that I've talked to say that about 3% of the state workforce enters to retirement. And it's about the same for local governments. And then you hire new people in. The new people will be coming in under the less generous pension benefit formula. But it's going to take 15 years, 20 years before you reach a point where more people are getting lesser benefits than people who are receiving more generous benefits. That's kind of the tipping point, probably 20 years.
Okay. How much of the pension problem was due to a down market? And as the market rebounds, isn't that unfunded liability being erased or certainly diminished?
Well, I think what the market did was it exposed the weakness. It revealed that when you are trying to predict 30 years out what you're going to earn, it's virtually impossible, especially when you have a great recession hit you right between the eyes. But there are a lot of people who think that even prior to that, the pension funds were in trouble. They just weren't fessing up to it.
Okay, one way you could address the problem is by changing the discount rate. Instead, right now they're saying it's going to return 7.5% on their investments. If you'd lower that, you'd increase employee contributions. Is that easier said than done?
Well, you would increase employee and employer contributions. The government would have to kick in more too. That's you and me.
Right, the taxpayer.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, I mean, that is a very heavy lift politically. When you start moving that assumption down, you have to put your hand out for more money. And for CalSTRS, we were just talking about them, they're in a unique position because they can't demand that the government give them more money, whereas other pension funds generally can.
You know, I want to ask you about some of the issues revolving around bankruptcy. There's some communities like San Bernardino are using bankruptcy to kind of negate their pension obligations. Do you think that's going to be a winning strategy?
I think there's a lot of baggage that goes with bankruptcy. When you just think about people who file bankruptcy personally, there's a tendency to say, oh, they're irresponsible, they're just sloughing it off. It's a painful process. I don't know that Stockton exactly had a banner that said, biggest city to declare bankruptcy. I don't think they were really proud of that.
I think Detroit has that banner.
Detroit now has that distinction, and I don't think they're flying that on their letterhead either. There are real downsides to bankruptcy. I do think that as governments get put in a corner, you'll see that used more, but I think they will do everything they can to avoid it.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to discuss the current and future political fallout, if any, of public employee pension reform. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Jon Ortiz, who writes the Sacramento Bee's State Worker blog. You know, is all this talk about public employee pensions a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing? I mean, is the issue off the table?
I think that the state legislature views it as such, but the local governments are really struggling with this, as we just mentioned a few moments ago, that you have local government just facing growing pension obligations. CalPERS is going to be demanding more from their employers in the coming years. So for them, it is not off the table. They spend so much of their budgets now, 70, 80% in some cases, on employee compensation. The state only spends about 15, 20%. So there's a disconnect politically between the legislature and the locals. And I think as the locals struggle more, the issue has legs.
So in the future, what are we going to see in terms of pension reform? Are we going to see bankruptcy like we talked about earlier? Are we going to see more legislation? Are we going to see an initiative on the ballot?
Bankruptcy is case by case, painful, and takes a long time. You'll see some of that, but I don't think that solves the problem. The legislature is not going to act because their attitude is going to be, we've done this, let's see how it goes. That leaves the initiative process. I think very definitely you will see a move again this year to try to get something on the ballot for 2014. If that fails, it's an evergreen issue. It will come up again and again and again.
You know, you recently wrote about an out-of-state shadow 501c4 organization called the Action Now Initiative. They may be getting involved in San Jose Mayor Chuck Reed's pension reform initiative. I guess initially he asked them to bankroll that initiative, that pension initiative, by $200,000. First of all, do you think he'll get that measure on the ballot? And secondly, is that worth it to him to have a shadowy out-of-state organization bankrolling an initiative? Is it worth the political blowback?
Well, it certainly will hand the opponents of the initiative a huge stick to swing, and they already are. They're making great hay out of this too, which is a relatively small amount of money. It takes $3 million, $4 million bucks to get a measure on the ballot for signature collection. You're going to spend that much.
That's all.
Yeah. So $200,000 is not a huge amount of money, but it's already being used as something of a bellwether by the anti-pension reform crowd. Look, it only takes a couple of people willing to write a couple $1 million checks. They're out there. And I think that could happen.
You know, last go around with the initiatives, the majority of those initiatives were bankrolled by like 1 or 2 people.
That's right.
So they have a big influence on the outcome or whether these things even get on the ballot. You know, pensions seem to be the quintessential kick the can down the road kind of issue. Employees defer wage increases, and the cities and counties and state are more than happy to have those wage increases deferred with the promises of a generous pension down the road. But then when the pension comes due, they say, well, we really can't afford it. Oh, we're going to go now turn to our new employees and reduce their pensions up. Is that a good strategy?
Well, I think it's an understandable strategy because you think about it, the people who make these promises are in and out of office. They make a promise, they're gone. They don't have to deal with the results. The employees sometimes are with their employer for 20, 30 years. And so you can see from their perspective, it's very unfair. And I think it's just bad management. Promise less, give more.
You know, it's interesting when they have a different situation for current workers and new employees. I'm just wondering, over time, you might have a workforce that's split half and half between the old system and the new system. And so a new employee under the new system, is working under a much lower pension calculation. I wonder how he or she is going to feel working next to someone who has a much more generous pension calculation. I wonder about the employee morale implications.
Yeah, I suppose that it depends on what's happening in the economy at large. If other people in the private sector are enjoying great 401ks and can look forward to, rich lifestyle after they work, perhaps that civil service employee with the lesser benefit will feel pretty bad. But if they look out at the landscape and they see that they're still relatively better off, I don't know that they'll be complaining much.
You know, ask one last quick question. We've only got 30 seconds left, and
yeah,
it's probably unfair to ask the question, but what about retiree healthcare? We haven't even talked about that. It's basically a pay-as-you-go system. Anything going to be done to address that issue?
I think Governor Brown will take a look at it in his second term. Pension reform was the first issue, first term. $64 billion debt that the state's racked up, and it's growing. He'll take a look at it in the second term.
Well, I want to thank Jon Ortiz from the Sacramento Bee State Worker blog, Christy Bouma with the Capital Connection, and Marcia Fritz with Californians for Fiscal Responsibility for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
Pension reform is a tough challenge for both elected officials and voters concerned about runaway costs and unfunded liabilities. This was made clear when California Governor Jerry Brown was left with no choice but to exempt transit workers from the state's pension reform law, at least for the time being. This was because federal officials were poised to cut off billions of dollars to local transit districts if California didn't back off. Now we're seeing California mayors opposing a 2014 statewide pension ballot initiative that's being pitched by San Jose Mayor Chuck Reed. San Jose, despite its thriving high-tech industries, is the poster city for sky-high public pensions draining a general fund. Reed's proposal would give California cities and other public agencies the power to negotiate changes to employee retirement benefits. Employees would keep the benefits they had earned up until their contract changes, but could see reduced benefits going forward. Anyone who claims to have a crystal ball on whether pension reform succeeds or fails is fooling themselves. Eventually, many of the big questions will be decided in court. This is Bill McEwen for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.